Good day, philosophers. In our last module, we were reflecting on the connection between time and eternity, and we saw Plato's definition of time in the Timaeus. And this led us on this reflection to realize that in Plato's mind, influenced by Heraclitus, our initial taking of all of reality is that everything is constantly in flux. Everything is constantly changing. And this posed a huge problem for us. That metaphysical idea posed a huge problem for us to even understand how knowledge is possible. Because how could we know anything if everything is always changing? And so we saw towards the end of class that Plato did have a notion of a sort of unchanging reality, of things that truly were eternal. And those are the true objects of knowledge that we'll seek. And that's what we're going to explore in this last module now of studying Plato. And so in our first lecture here, in our final module studying Plato, we're going to be reflecting on a quote that actually goes all the way back to book 1 of Plato's Republic, something that we read some weeks ago. But there was in an exchange between Socrates and Thrasymachus, Thrasymachus uttered this statement. He said that along the way, no craftsman ever make errors. And so let's reflect on that. Now, I did ask you to reflect on this quotation already in the discussion board, but let's think about it a little bit together. What could it possibly mean that no craftsman ever make errors? Now, initially, this just is preposterous. Craftsmen make errors all the time. People always are making mistakes. That seems to be like one of the main things that shows that people are people. And we always got to reflect that we need to be patient with people because of the mistakes and the errors that they make. And when I think about my own life, it's riddled with errors and mistakes. So what does Plato mean? No craftsman ever makes errors. And of course, Thrasymachus is saying this, and so maybe we'll just say, oh, that's just a stupid thing that a sophist would say. We don't really care. And I would argue, though, that Plato actually wants us to take this statement extraordinarily seriously. Let's take it seriously. Let's assume it's true in his mind that no craftsman ever make errors. What could possibly make sense of this? Well, let's go through some of the things that I've heard at least students say in the past as they try to reflect on this quote, right? So one thing that I've heard students say is that, no craftsman ever makes errors because people sort of learn from their mistakes. They learn from mistakes. And so that's interesting. But could that satisfy the statement, no craftsman ever make errors? Well, if we learn from mistakes, that's not saying that people don't make mistakes. It's just saying that mistakes aren't all that bad, right? But I don't think that's really what Plato is saying here. He's not saying that we get better because of our mistakes. He's saying that we don't make errors at all. There are no errors. And it would seem to me like I've messed some stuff up in my life. I like to build stuff out of wood, and I've tried to make some cuts, at particular angles, and then I realized that I messed up the angle. And as they say, measure twice, cut once. And there's times where I measure twice, and I still had to cut a couple times because I make mistakes. And so I did learn from that, but that was a fact mistake. So I don't think this is really what Plato is going for here. Another idea that I hear students say is something like, well, when you think about a craftsman is sort of like an artist, right? And in art, there's no errors, right? In art, there are no errors, right? In this sense that the sort of like the artist, right? The artist, is the authority on their work, right? And so if an artist is painting some type of beautiful thing, or a craftsman is making some type of cool piece, then they are the actual authority on their work, right? Who's to say what they were doing was good or bad, right or wrong, the mistake? The artist is completely in charge, and they can say, no, that's exactly what I intended to do. So someone goes into an art museum and says, oh, this. I don't even know what they would say. I'm not an art expert, but if someone tried to complain, oh, this aspect of how you drew these two lines together doesn't quite fit with the standard practice of that, style of neo-cubism or something. I don't even know, right? And then the artist could say, it's like, you are so simple-minded. I intended it to be precisely that way, and that's fine. Okay. All right. So that is an interpretation, and there's some truth to that, because in the arts, there is a certain kind of authority that goes to the artists themselves, where they could sort of explain away what other people perceive as a mistake is not actually being a mistake, because they are the authority of their art. But the issue here is, though, is that remember when Plato used the word craftsman, right? He didn't just mean like artists. He's not just talking about people where they're making something that are some expression, self expression. He's not talking about people who are just trying to even make something that's purely beautiful. When he talks about the craftsman, right, he's talking about like almost everyone, right? Right? Almost everyone is a craftsman, right? And so, like, remember we even talked about how, like, I'm a teacher and I'm a craftsman, right? And why am I a craftsman? Well, I perform a craft. My life's work is to do this kind of good service for my students and for their families. I try to teach people things that matter, right? And so that is a craftsman. So I'm not exactly like an artist. Do I make a mistake as a teacher? Are there times when I mess up? Yeah, right. And even like a carpenter, if you're trying to think of a carpenter again as someone who is a craftsman, carpenters do mess up. They can't like explain away like, oh, I made this rocking chair that it was only meant to work for about 5 minutes before it fell apart. No, like you can't get away with that. The people make errors. So here's the weird thing. We can't deny the fact that there are errors. There are errors. And Plato is not saying that there's no such thing as errors. He's saying that no craftsman ever makes errors. So again, now, what the heck does he mean by that? Well, we need to kick this up yet another notch. And to really get to his point, let's actually open up the text and see where he said this, right? And so this was in Plato's Republic, book 1, around line 340D, as you'll see there. And I'm looking it up. I should have this marked already, but I did not. So it's taking me a second to find it. Here we go. Right, let's see here, right? And I'm going to zoom in on that just a little bit here. All right, so here we see Thrasymachus, in the midst of a discussion with Socrates. And this is coming out of Thrasymachus' mouth, not Socrates', but we're still taking it seriously. So let's start in this whole paragraph. It's page 17 if you've got the CDC Reeve translation of the text. He says, Thrasymachus says, "That is because you are a quibbler in argument, Socrates. I mean, when someone makes an error in the treatment of patients, do you call him a doctor in virtue of the fact that he made that very error? Or when someone makes an error in calculating, do you call him an accountant in virtue of the fact that he made that very error in calculation? I think we express ourselves in words that taken literally do say that a doctor is an error, or an accountant or a grammarian. But each of these, to the extent that he is what we call him, never makes errors, so that according to the precise account," and you are a stickler for precise accounts, that heck yes, Socrates is, "no craftsman ever makes errors," right? It is when his knowledge fails him that he makes an error, and in virtue of the fact that he made that error, he is no craftsman. Ooh, so this is this interpretation that we're going to see here. Ultimately, what we're saying is that when someone makes an error, they aren't what they say they are, right? It's in virtue of the fact that someone makes an error that they demonstrate the reality of their ineptitude. that what they really are isn't what they say that they are, or the way that we thought that they were, right? And so when we see this, no craftsman ever makes errors, in this third account, and this is really what Socrates is after, he's ultimately saying that when you make an error, you stop being a craftsman. When you make that error, you no longer are that craftsman. Now, this can sound kind of harsh, but let's reflect on this. I mean, and he gave a couple examples, but he says when we make an error, it's we don't proclaim that we are that thing because of our errors. We proclaim what we are. We are that thing because of our successes. Let's think about this, right? Let's just think about like a plumber, right? Let's think of story time. Think about a plumber. Say you happen to be a homeowner, and you have like some kind of leaky pipe, and you realize, okay, I need to like get this fixed, and so you call a plumber in, and the plumber comes to your house and says, oh, I'll come fix your leaky pipe, and you're like, great, and then he works for a little while, and then you pay him $300 or so, and it's like, great, okay. And then after this plumber drives away, about, say, half hour later, all of a sudden you hear, I don't know if you could hear that. That was supposed to be like water dripping. The pipe is leaking again. So what do? Well, you call the plumber back and you said, hey, buddy, you were just here, paid you $300, and guess what? Pipe's still leaking. Do you have time today to come on back and take a look? And like, what would the guy say? Well, I'm so sorry. I don't know how he made that error. I'm sorry about that. I think I've got this. You know what? I've got some time this afternoon. I will be right back over and I'll take a look and I'll get that fixed up for you in a jiffy. So let's say the guy comes back and, he works on your pipe for a while. And he said, you know what? I'm not sure. I think we've got this thing covered right now. You know what? No extra charge for my second trip out. And then you say, of course there was no extra charge for your second trip out. I already paid you and you didn't even fix it the first time. The guy said, oh, no, we have no extra charge. I got you. And so then the guy leaves. And then, as the story goes, all of a sudden, say half hour later, you hear once again, more leaking pipes. What do you do then? You call the guy back again. But what do you say? Do you say, hey, come back here? No, you probably are saying, you know what? I need my money back. I paid you to fix my pipe, and you didn't fix my pipe. You know why I need that money? Because you know what I need to do? I need to call a real plumber. Because guess what? You're not. You're not a plumber at all. Because you know what a plumber can do? A plumber can fix my pipe. Did you fix my pipe? No. Therefore, you're not even a plumber. I need my money. Have a beautiful day. Click. Well, I don't know if you'd say the have a beautiful day thing. Maybe that's just me. But what makes a plumber to some extent is doing what a plumber does, right? So when you reflect on what makes a craftsman, like I just noticed I forgot an F in that word right there, craftsman. But what makes a craftsman, right? It ultimately is connected to the definition of what that thing is, right? And what makes a plumber? Well, maybe they can plumb. I don't know. No, I mean, a plumber, let's say even now, of course, this is the kind of question that Socrates would ask us. Is like Socrates says, well, what is a plumber? Right. And then we'd have a big, long dialogue and probably end in aporia. But roughly speaking, I think it's safe to say that a plumber is someone who can fix pipes. Right. And so if you can't fix pipes, then you don't fall under that definition. And then you're not a plumber at all. And that's what Socrates is really going for. That's what Plato is really going for. It's Thrasymachus who says this. So I'm going to say Plato that's going for when he wants us to take seriously this idea that no craftsman ever makes errors. Because when we fail to fall under that definition, when we fail to be what you're supposed to be as a plumber, then you aren't a plumber anymore. We could think about other examples too. What if we're thinking about teachers, right? Here's a little picture of, hey, I recognize that guy. What makes a teacher a teacher? Have you ever had a teacher that wasn't a teacher? What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. What makes a teacher a teacher? To some extent, a teacher is a teacher if a teacher can teach. And what is teaching? Maybe again, this is something that Plato could lead us through a big self-reflection on. But to some extent, a teacher is someone who can lead students through a kind of experience that causes them to understand things in a deeper way or in a new way, understand things they didn't understand, or to be able to do things that they couldn't do. I mean, it's kind of what a teacher is. Have you ever had a teacher that wasn't a teacher? I mean, what makes a teacher a teacher? Is someone a teacher because they have a certified degree that says you are a certified state of Pennsylvania teacher? No, that's not what makes a teacher a teacher. A teacher needs to be able to do what a teacher is supposed to be able to do, right? And so you might have reflected, there's been probably teachers in your life that weren't even teachers, maybe even me sometimes, because what am I supposed to be doing? I'm supposed to be leading you to understand philosophy a little bit more deeply. And if I can't do that, then I'm not even a teacher at all, right? Or think about something else. Think about like a doctor, right? What makes a doctor a doctor? To some extent, you would have to say that a doctor is someone who can, facilitate the healing process of a person. Maybe a doctor literally cures a disease through the practice of their craft, right? Or the doctor at least somehow helps you and helps the body get healed. But the doctor has this body of knowledge that causes people to get well. Well, what would you say to like a doctor whose patient doesn't get well, or to a doctor whose patient dies? At first, it's like, are they not a doctor? Well, under this account, you might say, actually, at that moment, they fail to be a doctor. Because now that sounds kind of harsh, because the reality is that medicine is complicated, and medical professionals, there's times where despite your very best efforts and despite all the advances in our medical understanding, there's nothing that someone's able to do. And so to say that person's not a doctor because they failed at that moment seems maybe too much. But let's think about it. Like if you were a doctor or nurse, my wife's a nurse, and when you come home from work, the time that your patient didn't make it, and say like, man, I really doctored today. I was like killing it as a nurse. And then you realize, oh, no, that's not the moments that you demonstrated really fully what it meant to be a doctor or a nurse, maybe, right? At least on Plato's definition, if that's what we understand a doctor to be, is someone who can lead to the healing of a patient. So at those moments, potentially you aren't that thing anymore. Now, this sounds harsh, but this is holding us to a high ideal, right? It almost sounds like in order to fall under the definition, to be a true craftsman, what do you have to be? It seems like you have to have some type of perfection, right? That you have to fall under some kind of ideal. And actually, boom, that's exactly the case for Plato. He actually thinks that when we think about the true definitions of things, that they imply a kind of perfection, that in order to truly be something, you have to be it in a kind of perfect sense, right? And so if we reflect on this, if we even go back, remember we were talking about justice in the city 2 classes ago, and justice in the soul, and we realized that it almost sounded like, in order to have a truly just city, it sounded like a utopia to some extent. There would have to be a certain kind of perfect harmony between each part of the city and perfect harmony within ourselves. It almost sounds like a perfection that's impossible, but who cares if it's possible? Or let's not worry about possible or impossible. Let's just realize that that is the true reality of that definition, and that's what Plato is after when he says that something is a craftsman. In order to truly be a craftsman, we have to fall under the ideal or the perfection. Now, this in Greek leads to a particular word, right? And if you think of it just the word ideal, right? It sounds kind of like the word idea, right? The idea of a thing. And in Greek, the idea of a thing actually is in Greek something called the eidos, which sometimes is translated as the ideas, right? But also is translated as something called the forms, right? And so it's like the true form of the thing. The true eidos, the true form of a thing, is a kind of perfect ideal definition of what that thing is. And so when we're for Plato, and he's thinking about like whether or not you're a doctor or whether or not you are a teacher or a plumber or anything at all, he's going to say we need to reflect back and see to what extent we exhibit that true form of what it means to be that thing. Do we fall under the form, right? And now this is an immense challenge. To what extent do we fall into the form? We realize that all of us are imperfect, that we all fail to be perfect teachers or perfect anything. And so if you're not the perfect thing for Plato, then you're not even ultimately the real thing, right? Here's this cute little advertisement back. I don't remember, Coca-Cola used to advertise itself as the real thing, right? Because there was, say, lots of imitation colas that you could get, and Coke was like, no, we are the real thing. We are the reality, right? And so same kind of deal here, that Coke sort of is supposed to be like the form of colas. Now, of course, that's just an advertising ploy. But for Plato, that's the idea. In order to truly be something, to truly be a craftsman, you have to obtain some type of perfection. And for him, that would mean that you would have to be the true form of what it means to be that, right? Now, but we all fall short. And if we were to have to be held to that standard, then we'd realize that no one is a real plumber. No one is a teacher, right? No one is a doctor. And why? Insofar as we imperfectly manifest the essence of what it means to be these things. And that's what Plato means by the true form, right? But let's flip that around for a second. Let's flip it around, because do you agree that there are moments in our lives when we do manifest that form, right? Like, as much as I'll say, like, I'm imperfect as a teacher, there's times when I actually am able to teach, right? I exhibit what it means to be a teacher. There's times when I'm even a plumber, right? I'm all about YouTube and DIY and fixing stuff myself. I do that like constantly in my houses, right? Houses. That sounds like I have more than one house. No, I've owned more than one house in my life. In my current house, there's just one, and I work on it. And I fix it, right? Or and you might even argue that. And sometimes I'm a doctor because I have kids and I've done things to facilitate their health. So I love this picture, right? At that moment, right? At the moment when we actually do exhibit the form, when we do exhibit something about the definition of what it means to be that thing, then we are at that moment an image of that true form. Now, does this sound familiar? Remember when we were talking about how time is a moving image of eternity? Well, we're going to see here metaphysically that Plato is going to be arguing that all things are images of the true form of what that thing really is. I am an image of what it means to be a teacher at this very moment when I'm trying to teach you something in this imperfect online education way, right? And so in some sense, though, like almost every person, this guy, right, whoever, every person is at times a plumber, and every person can be a teacher, and every person can be a doctor at the times that they manifest that form. But the idea is never in the true form itself, but as just an image of it. And notice that out at the top of the screen, I have this word participation, right? And this is the sense in which we exhibit a form for Plato. He uses this phrase participation, right? Where some type of individual thing, where an individual shows, and I'm using that in sort of a metaphorical way, shows the form, right, imperfectly, right, or incompletely, right, in themselves. And so in some ways, this idea of the forms, and we'll talk about the forms more in our next video. But Plato thinks these forms are like real, eternal things that are the true perfection and the true reality itself, right? And he says that we, as people here in this world, we participate in the forms by, in some ways, exhibiting imperfectly and incompletely some aspect, the reality of the form, at least within ourselves in some ways. Let's actually look in the text real quick and see kind of where we can see this laid out. And we're going all the way to book 5 now in Plato's Republic. Remember how we were talking about justice, right? We spent 2 weeks ago spending a long time talking about Plato's ideas of justice. And but there's a really interesting statement here where we'll start to see how Plato's idea of participation really comes out in the text here, right? So in fact, here, let me make as we can see here. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger still. Let's go to this guy here. So here we see Plato, book 5. This is around marginal line 472C approximately. And if you're using our translation, it's page 165. Here we see Socrates talking about justice, right? And he says, he's talking about justice with Glaucon. He says, however, if we discover the nature of justice, should we also expect the just man, justice versus the just man, not to differ from justice itself in any way, but on the contrary, to have entirely the same nature it does? Or will we be satisfied if he approximates as closely as possible to it and partakes in it far more than anyone else? So here we see Socrates talking about the difference between justice and the just man. It's sort of like last class. Remember how we were talking about beauty and the beautiful face, right? And how beauty is something that's different than just the particular beautiful faces we might encounter. We see the same thing here as Socrates talks about justice. He says, when we think about justice itself, do we expect the just man to be entirely the same thing as justice? No. A person is never the same thing as justice. But what we do is we approximate justice in our own lives as best as possible, and we partake in it more than anyone else, so that the truly just person exhibits justice, participates in justice, manifests justice to some imperfect, but still with some type of perfection, right? And so when we think about justice itself, in this next line, we see Socrates says, so it was in order to have a model that we were inquiring into the nature of justice itself and the completely just man. Right. So notice that he says ultimately that the truth of the form, as we're going to understand it, is like a model. The true form is like a model that we exhibit within ourselves, that we participate in that model. And that if we can understand that true form, we can understand that true definition of that model, we can see to what extent any particular individual participates in justice or fails to participate in justice. And that is what leads us to Plato's theory of the forms. And that is in some ways is probably the most famous of all aspects of Plato's thought. when Plato talks about the forms and these metaphysical ideas of these eternal perfect realities of things, that everything that we experience is just participates in. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about, the theory of the forms in our second lecture here. But this is what he's getting at. And so I hope you can see how that when Plato looks at the world that we experience, the world of flux, as Heraclitus saw it, he realizes that we are not perfect. We are not the definitions of things, that we are constantly changing. And yet, in order to understand what we are, we need to put ourselves in reflection against the real thing. We need to realize that we aren't the real thing, that the true reality itself is the definition. The true teacher is the form of teaching, and any person that you meet isn't a true teacher. They just participate it, maybe at best better than others, but all of us at some moment could demonstrate something about, in our imperfections, still something about what it means to be a teacher, and therefore that form can show up to us in its participating individuals and the people we actually encounter in imperfect ways. All right, so we'll explore this some more in our next video. Have a beautiful day, and I'll check you there. Adios.